At dawn on the 1st of September 1939, the silence over the Polish border broke all at once. Engines roared, the ground shook, and out of the mist came something the world had never truly seen before. This was not the slow, grinding warfare of the trenches that had defined the last war. This was fast, coordinated, merciless. The Germans had a name for it. Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. Welcome back to the series. Last time, we watched the fuse burn all the way down, 20 years in the making. Today, it finally reaches the powder keg. This is episode 2. So what actually was a Blitzkrieg? The idea was simple to describe and terrifying to face. Instead of a long, static front line, where two armies bled each other white over a few miles of mud, German forces struck with speed and overwhelming concentration. Fast tanks punching through at a single chosen point. Motorized infantry racing to keep up. And dive bombers screaming down out of the sky, working in constant radio contact with the troops on the ground. Some of those bombers were even fitted with sirens, designed for one purpose: to terrify. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy army. It was to shatter its ability to think. To hit so hard, so fast, from so many directions at once, that command and communications simply collapsed before any real defense could form. And here's the crucial detail that people often miss. Other nations had tanks too, some even had better tanks. The German breakthrough wasn't really about the machines. It was about how they were used, concentrated into powerful armored fists, instead of spread thin and tied together by radio, so that tanks, infantry and aircraft could act as a single fast-moving body. It was a new way of thinking about war. And most of Europe simply wasn't ready for it. On that first morning, more than 1.5 million German soldiers poured across the Polish frontier. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, swept the skies, striking airfields, railways and cities. The small town of Wielin was one of the very first places struck from the air, bombed in the opening minutes of the war, before many of its people even understood that a war had begun. At the mouth of the harbor near Danzig, a tiny Polish garrison on a spit of land called Westerplatte, expected to hold for hours, held out for 7 days against overwhelming fire. And Warsaw, the capital, refused to give in, enduring weeks of siege and relentless bombardment before it was finally forced to surrender at the end of September. Now, there's a famous myth about this campaign that we should clear up. You may have heard that Polish cavalry, on horseback, charged German tanks with lances, a romantic image of hopeless bravery. In reality, that story is mostly propaganda and exaggeration. Polish cavalry were mobile infantry. They fought with modern weapons and at times fought very effectively. The truth is that Poland's army was brave and in many places skilled, but it had been built in large part for a different kind of war. Fixed defensive lines, slower supply chains. Spread thin along a vast exposed border, facing tank columns and waves of aircraft, courage alone was never going to be enough. Within days, German spearheads had punched deep into the country, bypassing whole pockets of resistance and leaving them to be dealt with later. And then, on the 17th of September, came the second blow, and it came from behind. Just as Poland was fighting for its life against Germany in the west, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. This was the hidden price of that pact, signed only weeks earlier in Moscow. 2 dictatorships, carving a nation in half between them. Poland was now being devoured from both sides at once, with nowhere left to retreat. By early October, organized resistance had ended. The nation had not surrendered in spirit, a government fled into exile, and an underground resistance would fight on in the shadows for years. But as a country on the map, Poland had been erased. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September, just 2 days after the invasion began. And here's the part that surprises almost everyone. For months afterward, almost nothing happened. No great offensive in the West, no major battles. Newspapers of the time started calling it the Phoney War. The Germans had their own word for it, the sitting war. French troops sat behind their enormous fortified barrier, the Maginot Line, a wall of concrete, guns, and underground tunnels, utterly confident that it would hold. German forces, for the moment, looked the other way. It was an eerie, tense calm, like an entire continent holding its breath. That calm shattered in April of 1940. Germany depended on iron ore shipped down from Scandinavia, and it needed to protect its northern flank. So it launched a sudden invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark, small and flat and impossible to defend, fell in a matter of hours. Norway fought back harder, with British and French troops rushed in to help. But by June, Norway too was under German occupation. The Lightning War had just proven it could strike by sea and by air every bit as effectively as it struck across open plains. But the blow the entire world was truly bracing for came next. On the 10th of May, 1940, Germany unleashed its full might against Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France itself. The Netherlands, a small and neutral country, resisted for just 5 days. Its will to fight was finally broken when German bombers devastated the heart of the city of Rotterdam, killing hundreds of civilians and leaving thousands homeless, with the threat that other Dutch cities would be next. The Dutch laid down their arms. It's worth remembering that, going into this, most military experts fully expected France to win, or at the very least, to hold the line for years, as it had done before. The French army was large, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. On paper, this looked like an even fight. The French and British commanders were expecting a repeat of the First World War, a slow, heavy push through central Belgium, much like 1914. So they sent their very best forces racing north to meet exactly that. It was a trap. The real German breakthrough came somewhere else entirely. Through the Ardennes, a dense, hilly, forested region that Allied planners had dismissed as simply too difficult for tanks to pass. They were catastrophically wrong. German armored divisions threaded through those forests, emerged onto open ground near the town of Sedan, crossed the Meuse River, and broke out into the French countryside. Then they turned and drove hard for the English Channel, slicing a blade directly behind the Allied armies that had rushed into Belgium. It was called the sickle cut, and it worked with devastating speed. In a matter of days, hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers found themselves cut off, encircled, pressed backward toward the sea, with their supply lines severed behind them. France, on paper, one of the most powerful militaries on the planet, was coming apart faster than anyone had believed possible. Understand what a shock this was at the time. Just 2 decades earlier, Germany and France had fought each other to a standstill for 4 brutal years, over a few miles of the same ground. Now, that same ground was being crossed in days. It wasn't that the French soldiers lacked courage, or even that they lacked good equipment. They had been outthought, beaten by a faster, bolder idea of how a modern war should be fought. Those trapped armies were squeezed into a single French port town, Dunkirk. And what happened there has become one of the most extraordinary stories of the entire war. The harbor was too damaged to use safely. German forces were closing in. Hundreds of thousands of men were trapped on open beaches under air attack, with their backs to the water. So the British government launched a desperate evacuation. Warships, yes, but also fishing boats, pleasure yachts, ferries, lifeboats. Anything that could cross the channel and pull men off that sand. They became known as the little ships. ordinary sailors and civilians steering tiny vessels into a war zone. Over roughly 9 days, more than 300,000 British and French soldiers were lifted off that beach and carried home. Overhead, Royal Air Force pilots fought desperately to keep German bombers off the men crowded on the sand below, often out of sight of the soldiers they were protecting. And there was one strange stroke of fortune. At a critical moment, the German advance had actually paused, a controversial halt order that gave the trapped Allies precious days to organize the escape. Historians still argue over exactly why. But that pause may well have saved the British Army. Make no mistake, this was a crushing military defeat. Nearly all of their heavy equipment, tanks, trucks, artillery, was left burning on the sand. But the men themselves survived. And an army that lives to fight another day is not a broken army. Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, warned his own parliament not to mistake it for a triumph. Wars, he reminded them, are not won by evacuations. And yet, the sheer scale of the rescue lifted a nation's spirit at the darkest possible moment. With the British Army gone from the continent, France now stood alone against the full weight of the German war machine. And it did not last long. German forces wheeled south, swept past the now useless Maginot Line, simply going around it, and drove straight for the capital. To make the humiliation complete, Italy chose this moment to declare war on a France already on its knees, stabbing at it from the south. On the 14th of June 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The city was largely undefended, its government had already fled south. Barely 6 weeks after the invasion had begun, France asked for an armistice. And the terms were designed not just to defeat France, but to humiliate it. Hitler insisted the surrender be signed in the exact same railway carriage, in the exact same forest clearing at Compiègne, where Germany itself had been forced to sign its surrender back in 1918. It was revenge, staged with theatrical, deliberate precision. France was then carved in two. A German-occupied zone across the north and the entire Atlantic coast, and a nominally independent state in the south, run from the town of Vichy, that would collaborate with the Nazi regime. Nearly 2 million French soldiers were marched off into German captivity. Take a moment to sit with how fast all of this happened. Poland crushed in weeks. Denmark in a single day. Norway in weeks. The Netherlands 5 days. Belgium 18. And France, a nation with one of the largest armies in the entire world, defeated in about 6 weeks. The whole European continent, from the Arctic Circle down to the Spanish border, was now either occupied by Germany, allied to it, or bowing to its will. Only one major power in Western Europe was left standing. An island, just across a narrow strip of water. Led by that same new Prime Minister, who had just told his people that blood, toil, tears and sweat were all he could offer them. Adolf Hitler now turned his gaze across the channel, fully expecting that after witnessing this collapse, the British would come asking for terms. He was about to discover just how badly he had misjudged them. That's exactly where we pick up next time. With a single lone island, standing against an empire that controlled almost an entire continent. And a battle that would be fought not in the mud, but in the skies above English fields. That's episode 3. Britain stands alone. If this series is doing it for you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment, tell me, do you think France could have held on if the Allies had only guessed correctly where the real attack was coming from? See you in the next episode.